Human sacrifice is simply something that the human race does, whether we like it or not. In almost every era, there is some kind of ideology which prescribes, justifies, and sanctifies death. And in the modern era, it's very clear that that ideology is the most extreme left-wing form of liberalism, which leads left-wing parties to become the parties of death for the democratic age. The classic example of human sacrifice comes from Mesoamerica, in which the Aztec and the Mayan civilizations literally sacrificed war captives to nourish and placate the gods to ensure that the sun would indeed rise again the next day. The sacrifice was for a higher purpose, a divine ideal, and was concerned with the correct ordering of the cosmos. It was as much a moral act as it was a temporal one. The general shape of their thoughts was that there is a metaphysical plane in which morality is held to reside, and the real world ought to map closely to this plane in order to resemble it. Only in this way can our world be said to be righteous, proper, and just. The moral shape of our world must be brought into alignment with the spiritual world, so it might intersect with our own and infuse the ordering of our world with the moral substance of the other world. Finally, then, can we have peace of mind that our world is a good world. Sacrifice, therefore, changes the ontological status of a civilization. The sacrifice takes them from being fallen, immoral, and subject to divine wrath by failing to uphold the mandates of the gods, to being in the favour of the gods, to being just, ordained, and upstanding. A human life must, in cold blood, be taken for the moral order to be restored and maintained. And in the case of Mesoamerica, the more human lives that were sacrificed, the better. I have actually completed a full audiobook of the Popol Vuh, the Mayan epic of creation, which I'll link in the description if you would like to understand why their worldview is like this. It is easy to draw parallels between the impetus behind Mesoamerican sacrifice and the modern left, because now, as then, there is indeed a party of death, and it is a powerful moral force which impacts the very structure of our civilization. Consider the sacred status of abortion in left-wing thought. A core tenet of liberal ideology is the freedom of the will. Any contingent phenomenon which inhibits the freedom of the will is immoral, and while a person's will is being unjustly contained by reality, whether that person is responsible for their own circumstances or not, then, for the liberal, the spiritual plane of morality loses touch with the real world, and must be brought back into line, or else the world becomes an unjust place, where the human suffering of being forced to mature into an adult who cares for their own child is thrust upon a woman against her will. Her ontological status changes. She is no longer free, she is now a mother, and tied down to obligations and duties which she did not wish to adopt. In order to free her of this burden, abortion takes the place of a holy right in liberal theology, as it accomplishes a moral goal rather than a practical one. If a woman is unable to terminate the life of her unborn child, then she is subject to evil and immoral outcomes because her freedom of choice is being inhibited. A woman's right to choose death for her own progeny is, for the modern liberal, a sacred act of sacrifice. If a woman is unable to terminate the life of her unborn child, then she is subject to evil and immoral outcomes because her freedom of choice is being inhibited. A woman's right to choose death for her own progeny is, for the modern liberal, a sacred act of sacrifice. If a woman is not able to choose, and has her will thwarted in this way, then the cosmic order of the liberal universe is misaligned, and a terrible injustice has been wrought. In these circumstances, it is only the moral act of a human sacrifice that can bring the real world back into alignment with the liberal metaphysical plane, and reinfuse our reality with the moral substance that will put the liberals' mind at ease. We see this in the reaction to the repealing of Roe v. Wade, and the restoration of the question of abortion being returned back to the states. If this was simply a question of practical matters, then even the most ardent pragmatic defender of abortion would shrug and say, well, they made their beds, they will have to give birth in them, and go about their day. However, pro-abortion activists instead found themselves in a horrendous position, lamenting the lack of moral rectitude that had befallen the United States. There were some places in their country where women were not entitled to sacrifice their own children to restore the moral order of the nation. Needless to say, this will trouble them forever, and they will never let it go. As with the Mayans and the Aztecs, death is a core part of their moral system, and the inability to sacrifice a human life to restore the moral order makes them feel that the world is fallen, brought to calamity, immoral, and in need of purification. Child sacrifice is, of course, not the only aspect of death that the left seeks to leverage in order to make our civilizations fully in line with their own moral view of the universe. There are many other ways in which people must be sacrificed. Euthanasia is the latest moral fad to sweep liberal thought, because another core pillar of liberalism is the alleviation of suffering at all costs. Suffering, in pre-liberal thought, was understood to be an intrinsic aspect of life. All people would, at some point, suffer. Christianity taught that suffering was to be endured in order to reach a higher spiritual plane, and therefore prohibited suicide as a sin. Suicide inflicts terrible emotional pain on the victim's friends and family. To kill yourself is to leave a void in the hearts of those who love you, forcing them to forever wonder if there was something they could have done differently, whether it was somehow their fault. However, to the modern liberal, if a person is suffering in any way, then the moral thing for the liberal to do is simply to encourage them to end their own life. Instead of enduring the pain for the sake of others and to attain a higher spiritual goal, the existence of the pain itself puts the world outside of the correct moral cosmic order, for their goal, the liberal goal, is to end pain entirely. Whilst you suffer, the liberal is in an emotional state of unease, and therefore the best thing you can do is to terminate your own life for the moral good of their universe. It doesn't matter if you are an otherwise physically healthy person who is put into a state of depression because modernity has deprived you of a rich spiritual life. To them, it is good that you end your life, so that they can feel that the scales of pain versus pleasure are not unjustly weighted in the favour of pain. Moreover, you will be venerated as a saint for doing so. You will be written up by liberal newspapers as a virtuous person, despite the damage you have done to the lives of those who loved you. Because you felt sad, and your sadness has now disappeared from the world, your sacrifice will be held as an example of moral goodness, and you yourself will become an exemplar of the liberal world order. There are many other examples of how the left has embraced the morality of death. Another, more indirect example is the phenomenon of open borders advocacy. Any sensible person would desire border control to ensure that criminal elements of other societies could be kept out, so they would be unable to harm the nation's own citizens. But the extreme liberal position of open borders is yet another example of how the restriction of some people to preserve others brings the world out of line with the liberal metaphysical order, and this must be brought back into line, even though the liberals themselves know that this will result in death. In liberal philosophy, a liberal democracy is not really liberal if it distinguishes between different kinds of people. A true liberal views humanity as all of one kind, one people, universal individuals who belong to no place and no time. To have a border between a liberal democracy and a benighted non-liberal state is to render the world immoral and in need of change. As a step towards the universalization of mankind, to allow as many people as possible to illegally enter into the liberal democracy is a moral necessity, because it expands the breadth of the territory of morality. Until all of mankind is under the liberal order, then of course there will still be work left to be done, but the more of humanity that is under their remit, the better. They know that this means to allow unvetted, unchecked, and unknown strangers into the country, where they will be free to do whatever they please. They know that this makes liberal democracies a haven for foreign criminals, and it's no surprise that there is a disproportionate amount of criminality from such illegal immigrants. They have seen the statistics, they have read the news articles, and they don't care. They know there are going to be casualties of such a policy, and the victims of these people are worthy sacrifices for the construction of a world order that they can call truly moral. It is a similar story with the left's desire to empty the prisons. People are prisoners not by choice. They are instead victims of society, and so we must liberate them as soon as possible in order to bring about the correct liberal state of affairs. That this will lead to convicted criminals committing more crimes and creating more victims is understood, but accepted, because the morality of the issue is not in an individual event. It is in the overarching cosmic battle of right versus wrong, and to the liberal, right involves the deaths of innocents, and wrong involves the punishment of criminals. I could go on, but I think the point has been made that death in the form of human sacrifice is a core component of the left-wing liberal worldview. They need it to make the world a moral place, and they will stop at nothing until they get it. There is no person too important to be sacrificed. There is no death too gruesome to turn them away from their purpose. They are a philosophy of death, and they embrace that wholeheartedly.